And just so everybody knows, we are going to record this session and share it afterwards, just in case you'd like access to it. And then we'll also have some resources in the chat throughout the presentation. Alrighty, and Catherine, I think we can go ahead and get started if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, sounds great. So welcome everybody to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act presentation that we are giving with the A Better Balance and the Small Business Majority. I am Catherine, and I am a second-year Master's in Public Health student at Emory University, and I'm also the policy intern this summer for the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia.
And hey, y'all, my name is Cameron Dawson. I'm a senior staff attorney at A Better Balance's Southern Office in Nashville, Tennessee. And Catherine and I are going to be sharing some new information on how the PWFA can impact workers in Georgia. So we're very excited, and just want to share too that this is brought in partnership with our partners at Small Business Majority, who are alongside us here today. And we'll have another two-part series for employers so they know what their responsibilities are. And just to tell you a little bit more about A Better Balance, like I said, we have an office in Nashville, Tennessee, but we're also a national legal advocacy organization with offices in New Orleans, Denver, Washington, D.C., and New York. And our main mission is to use the power of the law to advance justice for workers so that they don't have to choose between their health or their family's health and their paycheck, and risk their economic security. And we do this through a few different strategies, including community and public outreach efforts, a legal helpline that provides free and confidential information, and then also legislative advocacy that is within a couple of areas such as pregnancy accommodations, caregiver discrimination, and paid family and medical leave and paid sick time, as well as some other areas that you see below. And I'll pass it over to Catherine.
Yeah, so at Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies, we are a Georgia-based statewide nonprofit with the goal of improving maternal and infant health through advocacy, education, and access to vital resources. So a lot of the work we've done with the PWFA, as well as this webinar, are part of our advocacy branch. And some of you may be familiar with our education branch, such as our perinatal virtual education platform, Pickles and Ice Cream, or the Help Me Grow line. And the vision of the Healthy Mothers and Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia is to produce a Georgia where every mother and baby has resources and support to be healthy and thrive. So basically, we just want to be in all spaces where births are happening in order to best serve and support the population of Georgia for birth givers and babies. We're also super thankful to our partners at Small Business Majority for partnering with us for this webinar series. They're a network of over 885,000 businesses and have advocacy efforts to support ongoing research. We're thrilled to partner with them on this event specifically, and in August they'll be hosting an employer-focused webinar, so stay tuned for details regarding that event. All right, so for today, this is just a brief little overview of what we're going to cover, just to kind of keep on track. So we're going to start with a brief overview of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, touch on why it matters specifically for the state of Georgia, and then we're going to go into a little bit more of the details regarding rights provided under the PWFA and how to talk to your employer about accommodations. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Cameron to start us with what is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act.
Thanks, Catherine. And I just want to say that over the span of a decade of advocacy with maternal health partners like Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia, business community, also worker organizations, we really did fight to protect pregnant workers and make sure that pregnant and postpartum workers were able to access the accommodations they needed to stay healthy and safe in the workplace. And so on June 27th, we saw that our efforts were rewarded as the PWFA went into effect. And actually, can you go to the past slide, the previous slide, please? Thanks. And the PWFA was part of the omnibus package that passed back in December of last year, and it went into effect this June. And it ensures that, you know, workers who have a pregnancy, a medical need related to their pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions have a clear right to receive reasonable accommodations or small changes in their workplace, whether that be to their job duties or their schedule. As we were hearing from so many workers across the country that, you know, they were being forced onto unpaid leave early on in their pregnancy when they were requesting accommodations. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about how important this federal law is to Georgia workers today and what that new law entails. So on the next slide, you'll see that this new law is in effect now, and it goes to cover workers with 15 or more employees. If you work at a job with 15 or more employees, or if you are a government worker, you are covered under this law. And it doesn't just cover employees, but also if you're interviewing for a job and you make your interviewer aware that you will need accommodations if you are to be hired, applicants are also covered. So if you have a need related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition like lactation or postpartum medical conditions or mental conditions, you can request an accommodation under this law, and we'll walk you through the steps of how to use that law and what type of accommodations you can request. So why is this important, Catherine? Can you explain a little bit more to what this might mean for Georgia workers?
Yeah, excellent question. Why is this important for Georgia workers? So to start, Georgia has a very high mortality rate, and Black women experience a gap in maternal mortality rate, specifically in Georgia. When compared to other women, it's at least 2 times greater for Black women than other women in the state. And also, most pregnancy-associated deaths are in the postpartum period. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act does extend accommodations to the postpartum period, so we can provide some wonderful protections. And specifically for Georgia, we're one of the few states without a specific statewide law for accommodations for pregnant workers. A state Pregnant Workers Fairness Act has been on the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies agenda for years. So we're thrilled to have a national policy now that we can shift our efforts from trying to implement this statewide to trying to pass it statewide to implementing it statewide. And Cameron, what are the reasonable accommodations?
Sure. And so, you know, an employer may not be able to provide accommodations right off the bat if a worker has not requested them. But what an employee can do is if they find that they have a need related to their pregnancy, such as, you know, needing a modified schedule or a frequent bathroom break, they can go to HR or their manager and ask for these accommodations. And their employer needs to provide those accommodations unless it would be what's called an undue hardship. So if it would be too expensive or too difficult for the employer to provide. But that is a high standard for employers to meet. And it really does depend on what type of resources the business has, but they have to meet that threshold and begin that interactive process if they're not able to give the employee their first request and try to find an alternative accommodation that still meets that worker's medical needs. And you know, reasonable accommodations can be many things depending on, you know, where you are at in the stage of your pregnancy. But Catherine's going to give some examples of what that could look like.
Yeah. So this is just a list of reasonable accommodations that was provided by the EEOC, which is the Equal Employer Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency that is regulating the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So some of them are the ability to sit or drink water, park closer so you can have a shorter walk into your building, flexibility in working hours in case you have to make a doctor's appointment, uniforms or safety apparel that are appropriately sized, extra break times for bathroom use, eating, drinking, water, resting, use of leave to actually recover from the process of childbirth, excusal from strenuous activities or activities that might expose you to chemicals that aren't safe for pregnancy. And they cover, all of these accommodations cover you from the prenatal period through postpartum, and also covers miscarriage, lactation, mastitis, and other parts of the postpartum period. These are, again, provided to us by the EEOC. These are still kind of pending. They're not set in stone, so some of these may change as well as the EEOC works to provide regulations. And we're going to kick it over to Cameron to give a little more in-depth analysis of the different accommodations.
Thanks, Catherine. And especially as we're starting to celebrate Black Women's Equal Pay Day today, it's important to think of what are the federal and state measures that can keep Black women and women in the workforce, throughout their pregnancy and even before their pregnancy. And the PWFA is just one measure that can really ensure that women are staying connected to the workforce. One of those reasonable accommodations can be actual time off to recover from childbirth, especially as, almost 3 million workers are not covered under the federal Family and Medical Leave Act. They may not work for a large employer, or they may only work part-time. So the PWFA does fill some gaps that are already in existing federal law. And, that can look like anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks of time off, really depending on what that worker's needs are and, what the business can provide. But we've also seen that the PWFA can provide reasonable accommodations to other postpartum mental conditions, such as postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. And so, really providing the support for workers to advocate for their own health and have the backing of the law so that they cannot face retaliation or, have their rights interfered with is really important. And we're very proud that this piece of legislation has been in effect for almost the month, well, actually the month today. And on the next slide, we'll kind of talk about some of those lactation accommodations. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act does also work with other laws like the Pump Act and the Federal Break Time for Nursing Mothers Act in providing, reasonable break time and a private space to pump breast milk in the workplace. And these breaks can be as needed. There's, not a limit to what those breaks can be, whether that be 2 to 4 breaks a day or for a certain amount of time. But you really do want to factor in the time it takes to walk to the station or the area, the time it takes to clean those materials and store them. And the PWFA does cover some workers who might be excluded from the Pump Act, such as flight crew or flight members, and some members of, the rail carrier industry who will not be covered by the Pump Act until 2025. But the only requirement is that they work for a workplace with 15 or more employees. And so some other accommodation requests we've heard from on our free and confidential helpline are, accommodations like modifying the equipment that a worker may need to wear, such as if they are a police officer and need to adjust their bulletproof vest or wear something different or have a different position because they no longer can wear that due to their belly or other pregnancy-related conditions. But if you do have questions about your right to certain accommodations or how to ask for them, we're going to provide some resources at the end of today to help workers, advocate for their rights. And when we talk about related medical conditions, we are still awaiting some rules and regulations from the EEOC, like Catherine mentioned, but we do know that lactation is included as a related medical condition, and also miscarriage and mastitis or other lactation related needs. And so if you do come back to work, but you need to have accommodations like a modified schedule or frequent breaks to continue to breastfeed or pump at work, or even to work from home, and it is related to your own health, that could be a type of pregnancy accommodation that you can request. And the PWFA doesn't just apply to those who are currently pregnant, but if you're trying to get pregnant, it also does cover those accommodations as well. But the goal is really to support workers as they initiate these conversations with their job and create a safe space where that where that business and that employee can really come to a solution that works for both parties. And on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the employee's rights and some of those protections that are in the PWFA. But for example, we have found that in some cases, workers may not be able to complete what's known as their essential job functions. These may be the main job duties that are in their job title, but the PWFA even still applies. So as long as a worker with pregnancy-related needs or childbirth-related needs is able to perform those duties in the near future, and they only need the accommodation for a temporary amount of time, the PWFA does enable them to have access to those accommodations that they request. And an employee cannot be punished for needing, requesting, or using an accommodation. So for example, their hours cannot be cut, or they can't be taken off the schedule after requesting an accommodation, and they can't receive attendance points for any days that are missed related to their pregnancy needs, especially if they have requested time off, for prenatal appointments or time off to recover from childbirth. So, if you do find that you are facing these types of punishments or adverse actions, definitely give us a call at 1-833-NEED-ABB and try to document, each of those conversations and instances to help you. And so lastly, I'll just say, oh, sorry. With the additional employee protections, the PWFA explicitly does have in its law certain protections regarding what employers can and cannot do. And it's going to be on the past slide. One more, go back one more. Madison, I think it's, yes, there we go. So with that, the employee cannot force an employee to take leave from work if a reasonable accommodation can be provided. So, for example, if a worker is able to have a shorter schedule or start work later in the day, rather than just be put onto unpaid leave, that may be a violation of the law. And an employer cannot force a worker to accept an accommodation that they choose not to accept if they don't have, for instance, a known limitation related to their pregnancy. Or, for example, if the accommodation is unnecessary to perform those essential job duties. And that really comes from instances where we see a worker may request a water bottle and instead, the employer tries to give them a modified or shortened schedule. And that's not necessarily what they need, and it's not, fit to their medical condition. So that would be something that might be unlawful. Oh, and I think we're seeing, yep, okay. And, lastly, I'll just say that the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act protects against retaliation if you do try to report a violation, as well as, in instances where an employer may try to deny promotions or other employment opportunities because a worker needs an accommodation or uses an accommodation. And so, especially in cases where, there may be different promotions or benefits that the worker may be entitled to, if they do believe that they were denied those because of their need for accommodations, that could be its own separate violation under the law. And like I said earlier, an employer may not be able to simply provide the accommodation simply because they believe that a worker may need it. The pregnant worker or the worker returning from pregnancy or childbirth will need to request an accommodation. And this is basically to make sure that there's no bias or, feelings that a pregnant worker cannot do the job like others. And honestly, too, some pregnant workers may not need an accommodation, but it's really, the goal is to make sure that if they do, they are able to ask for one safely and securely. And there's no magic words, so they don't have to use the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act or even, to say explicitly they're looking for a reasonable accommodation. But if they do tell a manager or HR that, they're having problems with their schedule or with work and it is related to their pregnancy, that puts the employer on notice that they do need to start beginning that conversation of, seeking what the accommodation could be. And, this can occur over the phone. in person or even, over email or other ways that, may benefit the business and the employee. And I'll pass it over to Catherine to kind of talk more about, some resources and ways that an employee can talk to an employer about accommodations.
Yeah, so as Cameron said, talking to your employer is an iterative process. It's going to take a lot of dialogue back and forth, but we do acknowledge that it can be intimidating to bring up these conversations with your HR department or your employer. So make sure you just utilize your phone, email, or in person. Again, as Cameron said, whatever you're most comfortable with will help you to kind of, be comfortable talking to your employer about needing these. The most important thing too is that you're open and honest. You have to share what barriers you're facing, and remember that if your employer says no or is not willing to collaborate with you on any of these accommodations, that now with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, these are rights that are guaranteed to you as a worker, and so the law is on your side. So feel free to, reference the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act or have your employer have some more research on that and work out next steps. It's also currently unclear if you will be asked to provide a doctor's note under the PWFA, but if you are, just make sure that it's specific for what your accommodation is and indicates how long your accommodation is needed so your employer can provide the best accommodations possible for you. And now I'm going to kick it back over to Cameron to touch a little more on what to do if the PWFA is violated in your workplace.
Thanks, Catherine. And like we mentioned earlier, this is a federal law. And so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, does oversee this law and manages any complaints that a worker or an organization or a person may file on behalf of a worker. Now, there is a certain window to file these complaints, and that is 180 days, since Georgia does not have its own version of a statewide PWFA or pregnancy accommodations law. Now, if you are a federal employee, there is a separate process through the EEO, but you can also acknowledge that information through the same website, the eeoc.gov. And, again, we do have some resources for workers to request or explain the law to their employer, and we'll share the link in the chat to those resources as well, just in case workers want to try to tailor that to their own health needs.
All right, now we're just going to run through a bit of a scenario to get some participation going. So on June 28th, 2023, Sarah works for a fulfillment center with 17 employees. She recently returned from maternity leave. She still is having issues lifting heavy items, which started during her pregnancy. So we're just going to take some answers in the chat. What are reasonable accommodations that Sarah would be entitled to under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act?
And there's no such thing as a wrong answer, but we're hoping to see a couple of different ideas based on Sarah's different needs.
Yes, thanks, Madison. Being able to give another option for jobs so she doesn't have to lift heavy things.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a couple more responses in the chat. Oh, and even a way to request it. I can only lift items for a few hours at a time.
I see we have a hand raised. Yes, to be excused from heavy lifting. Good. Ooh, accommodating PT sessions. That's a good point, Catherine.
Yes, and all of these could be reasonable accommodations, and there's no, such thing as just one accommodation at a time. She could ask for multiple accommodations, and her employer, depending on the size, would need to be able to provide those, unless it would cause an undue hardship. But they would still need to have to provide an alternative accommodation to fit her needs.
Yes. This is a good point too, making sure if you need a doctor's note for issues with heavy lifting, making sure there's a time frame on when lifting can resume for your job. All righty. I think these are all pretty good answers, so we'll go ahead and move on. Going back to Cameron.
And I did put in the chat some of our resources. So we have updated our Know Your Rights guide for pregnant and postpartum workers. And we do have this in English and in Spanish if a worker has questions about their rights to these pregnancy accommodations, or if they want a sample letter to their employer, or even just an explainer for themselves to share with other coworkers or other family members. They can access this on our website. We also have some information on the PUMP Act, which we didn't have time to discuss today, but the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act is an important law for some lactating workers, and it does cover teachers, nurses, as well as farm workers and other previously excluded workers, and that's on our website as well. But if a worker does want to talk directly to someone, they can either contact us at our helpline, or they can also visit our website, which I'll share on the next slide. And that's www.abetterbalance.org. They can go to our Workplace Rights Hub, and if they are caring for a family member or having a serious illness or disability, they can go click on their state, Georgia, and then find all the laws, based on different situations there, and use that as a tool. And our helpline number, again, is on the next slide, as well as our social media pages, where if you do have questions about your rights, you can call us for free and talk with an attorney in a confidential conversation. And if you are looking for a social media or to join our work in other aspects like paid family and medical leave or paid sick time to really build up economic security for workers, you can follow us on our social media pages. But I'll pass it over to Catherine to share more about the Healthy Mother, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia resources.
Yeah, and actually to give some more resources, I'm going to introduce Madison Scott, who is the Director of Policy and Research for Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies, to go a little more into Pickles and Ice Cream, our informational blog, and some other resources for healthy mothers.
Hey everyone, I am trying to man the PowerPoint and get my camera on at the same time. I'm not skilled enough for that, but I'll go ahead and share some of our resources. So Pickles and Ice Cream is our project that we do parent-facing resources and blogs and classes. It's basically an education platform that's done primarily virtually to give families information on everything they need to know about the prenatal period, the postpartum period, pregnancy in general, and those first few weeks with new families. So if you want to visit our Pickles and Ice Cream website, we have all of our articles and classes, all of the events, and then also just some fun quizzes and blogs that you can read to really get educated on what the pregnancy experience looks like. So while you're kind of in this period and you're seeking accommodations, Pickles and Ice Cream can be another really great resource to use during this time, as well as our Help Me Grow line. So Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia also has a resource center run through our call line. You can call into the Help Me Grow line anytime, Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, and we're happy to get you connected with resources, including the things that Cameron just shared, but also anything from housing to diapers to any kind of assistance that you may need really navigating what pregnancy looks like in Georgia. You're welcome to call in, and we're happy to help get you connected with providers or anything else that you need during this time. So we really appreciate you joining us for the webinar today. And I know that there may be a handful of questions. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording and open up the floor for any questions that people have. We want to be able to create kind of a private and safe space for us to bounce ideas off of each other. So give me 1 minute and I'll stop recording.